In 1971, a calm, well-dressed man boarded a commercial flight. He handed a note to a flight attendant. "I have a bomb." He demanded $200,000 and 4 parachutes. Hours later, with the money in hand, he had jumped from the rear stairs of a Boeing 727 to 10,000 feet above a freezing wilderness and vanished. No body, no identity, most of the money never recovered. Who was DB Cooper? This wasn't just a hijacking. It was a masterclass in deception, and the FBI's greatest unsolved mystery. You're about to uncover the plan, the jump, and the conspiracy behind the man who hijacked history and got away with it. November 24th, 1971, a chilly afternoon just before Thanksgiving in the United States. At Portland International Airport, travelers bustled through the terminal, eager to reach home for the holidays. A man could walk into an airport, buy a ticket with cash, and be on board in minutes. Dawn Cooper took seat 18C in the rear of the plane. Used to receiving flirtatious notes from male passengers, she tucked it into her purse without reading. Cooper leaned toward her and said softly, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." He ordered a bourbon and soda, lit a cigarette, both legal at the time, and waited. It was written in neat block letters with a felt-tip pen. The news reached the FBI and local law enforcement within minutes. But on board, something unusual happened. Nothing. Cooper boarded the Boeing 727-100, a small passenger jet with 3 rear-mounted engines, and a unique feature, an aft stairway that lowered from the rear fuselage. He wore dark sunglasses. He didn't shout or threaten anyone. Cooper was calm, polite, and even friendly. At around 5:45 p.m., the plane landed on a remote section of the airport, away from terminals. Cooper instructed that all 36 passengers be released in exchange for the money and parachutes. As they exited the plane safely, the FBI hoped to negotiate further. But Cooper wasn't done yet. $200,000 in unmarked $20 bills was collected, mostly older bills, their serial numbers recorded. 4 parachutes were secured from a nearby skydiving school. He wanted the plane to take off again, this time headed south toward Mexico City. He specified a low altitude of 10,000 feet and a cruising speed of no more than 200 knots. The landing gear would remain extended, and the rear air stairs would remain unlocked. They scoured the suspected jump zone, a vast, forested region near the Lewis River, north of Portland, by foot, helicopter, and boat. No body was found. No parachute. No trace. One of them was later discovered to be a non-functional training chute. A curious twist. Intentional or accidental? No one knows. They found men who resembled Cooper, who had criminal records or skydiving experience. All were eventually ruled out. Cooper never contacted anyone. No confirmed sightings ever occurred. It was as if he vanished completely. He ordered another bourbon and paid for it, even tipping the flight attendant. Or was it a red herring planted to throw off investigators? The rest of the money was never recovered. The case had become a legend. Part true crime, part American folklore. Some called him a hero, the man who beat the system, who stole from the air and escaped. Others saw him as a dangerous criminal who got lucky, a skilled ex-military man, a desperate outlaw. A myth, hope soared, but it was not Cooper's. The conditions were too rough. 10,000 feet in freezing rain, at night, into heavily wooded, mountainous terrain. Just a man sipping his drink, waiting for the next phase of his plan. Partial samples were recovered, but without a match, they were useless. In 2007, a parachute was discovered buried in a field in Washington. His fingerprints were never matched. The tie he left behind was analyzed, but DNA was not yet advanced enough to be useful. The Cooper hijacking remains the only unsolved case of air piracy in U.S. history. No bills from the ransom surfaced. Not in banks, not in circulation, not anywhere. He had chosen this model for a reason. He had no helmet, no clear landing zone, and the ransom weighed him down. But if he had died, where was the body? There was no panic, no chaos. "I want you to sit beside me." Cooper knew this. Among them was a man in his mid and a narrow black tie. Cooper agreed to a stop in Reno, Nevada, to refuel. The new flight path was cleared. Cooper remained calm, pacing the cabin, adjusting the parachutes, tying something to his waist. The ransom bag, perhaps, and a large battery, a convincing bomb replica or the real thing. No one could tell. He then gave his demands: $200,000 in cash, for parachutes, 2 main and 2 reserve, and a fuel truck ready to refuel the plane upon landing in Seattle. He warned her not to alert the passengers. The pilot, William Scott, contacted air traffic control. He moved slowly, confidently, and carried only a briefcase. At the Northwest Orient Airlines counter, he paid in cash for a one-way ticket to Seattle on Flight 305. He gave his name as Dan Cooper. In 1971, air travel was quite different. There were no ID checks, no metal detectors, no baggage screening. Flight 305 was a short journey, only 30 minutes from Portland to Seattle. There were 36 passengers and 6 crew members. Shortly after takeoff, Cooper handed a handwritten note to flight attendant Florence Schaffner, who was seated nearby. The aircraft could deploy its air stair during flight. a rare design feature. Startled, Schaffner opened the note. Cooper had taken his money, a satchel of $20 bills weighing over 20 pounds, and secured it to himself. His briefcase, his bourbon glass, a black clip-on tie, and a mother-of-pearl tie pin were all that remained. The FBI launched NORIAC, short for Northwest Hijacking, one of the largest investigations in the Bureau's history. No sign of the money, no parachute, no coup. They profiled skydivers, military veterans, and engineers. He had chosen one of the parachutes. No one knew what was about to happen. "I have a bomb in my briefcase," she did. When she sat down, Cooper opened the briefcase just enough to show her a glimpse of red cylinders attached to wires. The crew felt a shift in cabin pressure. Instruments indicated the aft stairs had been deployed. Cooper had jumped in the dark of night, in the middle of a rainstorm over the dense forests and rugged terrain of southern Washington. He disappeared into the void. Schaffner conveyed the message to the cockpit. The passengers had no idea the plane had been hijacked. On the ground, the FBI scrambled to gather the ransom. By the time Flight 305 reached Seattle's airspace, all of Cooper's demands had been met. With only the crew remaining, the pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, and one flight attendant, Cooper gave his next command. These strange instructions matched the 727's unique capabilities. The flight crew warned that the plane could not make it to Mexico without review. By 7:40 p.m., Flight 305 was airborne again, heading south through the rainy, turbulent skies of the Pacific Northwest. At 8:13 p.m., the rear of the aircraft suddenly jolted. When the plane landed safely in Reno, law enforcement stormed aboard. Cooper was gone. A massive manhunt began that night. The FBI interrogated hundreds of suspects. In the early months, agents believed Cooper must have died in the jump years past. Tips poured in. None led to Cooper. Then in 1980, nearly a decade later, a young boy digging on the banks of the Columbia River discovered a bundle of rotting $20 bills buried in the sand. Suddenly, hope was renewed. Was this where Cooper landed? Did he drown in the river, losing part of his money? The find led to another wave of investigations, but no further clues emerged. In 1986, the FBI released an age-progressed sketch of Cooper. In 2000, DNA testing began on the tie Cooper left behind. In 2016, after 45 years of chasing shadows, the FBI officially closed the case, citing the need to redirect resources. Who was Don Cooper? One thing is certain. In just a few hours on a rainy November night, he pulled off one of the most brilliant, mysterious, and cleanly executed crimes in modern history. The morning after Don Cooper's daring escape, the United States awoke to headlines that sounded more like a Hollywood thriller than reality. Man parachutes from jet with $200,000. Disappears. The operation dubbed NORIAC Northwest Hijacking had begun. This was now the most urgent criminal investigation in the country. The entire nation was stunned. Cooper was believed to have leapt somewhere near the Lewis River in southwestern Washington state, an area covered with dense forest, steep terrain, and nearly impassable wilderness. Rain and wind had been hammering the region that night, adding to the danger. In an era before mass surveillance, before digital footprints, a single man had hijacked a commercial airplane, extorted a small fortune, and vanished into the night. Ground teams trudged through mud, combing the woods. Boats moved slowly along rivers, hoping to find debris or, perhaps, a body. Their criteria were clear. They were looking for someone with skydiving experience, military or aviation background, knowledge of aircraft, and possibly someone who'd spent time in the Pacific Northwest. In 1972, less than 5 months after Cooper's jump, McCoy hijacked a similar plane in Utah, demanded $500,000, and parachuted to escape. He was caught 2 days later. His resemblance to Cooper's sketch was uncanny, but McCoy had an alibi for Thanksgiving weekend in 1971, and several differences in Mo made the FBI skeptical. Still, many remained convinced he was Cooper, pointing to the similarities as too perfect to ignore. It had instructions on how to operate the aft stairway of a Boeing 727, the same model Cooper had hijacked, but it raised more questions than answers. The placard was confirmed to be from Flight 305. It was the first piece of physical evidence found from the night of the jump. Had it fallen from the aircraft later, it provided no real answers, just more mystery. The bills were brittle, waterlogged, and partially decomposed. His shovel struck something unusual, a bundle of decaying $20 bills, a total of $5,800 in 3 stacks. Had Cooper dropped it during the jump? They looked at criminals with similar mo's, ex-paratroopers, disgruntled airline workers, even engineers who'd worked on Boeing jets. He matched Cooper's description and had access to aircraft knowledge. After his death in 19, his brother found large sums of money hidden in his house and photos of Christensen with the same type of Boeing 727 used in the hijacking. The D.B. Cooper case had become more than a mystery, a symbol of a changing America, an era before security checkpoints and mass surveillance. Amateurs and internet sleuths picked up the case, developing wild theories and complex After all, what kind of person plans a heist like that without an exit strategy? A time when a man could step onto a plane with a briefcase and disappear into the wild. No body, no parachute. A disgruntled veteran, a genius with nothing left to lose. No sign of Cooper. It sparked excitement, but experts quickly determined it wasn't from Cooper's jump. Someone who knew the 727's exact capabilities. The FBI tested Cooper's tie for DNA. They found partial profiles, but no matches in any criminal or military data. Not a scrap of fabric, not $1 of the ransom. Cigarette butts that could have yielded more evidence had gone missing, lost or discarded years earlier. Documentaries, podcasts, and books were released. Treasure hunters still scour the forests of Washington and Oregon, but the evidence was circumstantial, and Christensen was never conclusively linked to the case. But again, no other evidence came with it. Others suggested it had floated downstream and become lodged in the sand. Cooper was a woman. Cooper was a time traveler. Using electron microscopes, they examined particles on Cooper's tie, finding rare earth metals like titanium and cerium. An outlaw folk hero, based on flight paths, data, speed, and wind conditions, a man with engineering knowledge. Helicopters flew over ridges, diving low to scan for a parachute tangled in the tree, who understood flight paths, aircraft speeds, fuel limitations. A technician or engineer, possibly working with Boeing itself. These particles suggested that Cooper may have worked in a manufacturing or chemical plant, possibly Boeing or another aerospace facility, companies dealing with those materials in the 60s and 70s. Some pointed out that the location, Tenaba, was miles from the suspected drop zone, and the river's flow direction made that unlikely. But for weeks they found nothing. Their public statement was clear. They'd redirected resources to prioritized investigative matters. Online forums debate every scrap of evidence. Historians analyze every passenger manifest, every known suspect, every financial anomaly. The conditions were too brutal. Nightfall had made visibility near zero. It was pouring rain. But they also acknowledged the public's interests and left the door open to new tips. The evidence was archived, not destroyed. Others bordered on absurd. Cooper was a CIA operative. Cooper died in the jump but was eaten by wild animals. Cooper faked his death and lived in South America. The tie was standard. Nothing unusual, but the clip was higher quality. Before his death in 1995, Weber allegedly confessed to his wife that he was Don Cooper. She told the FBI, but his fingerprints didn't match those from the plane. No evidence supported his involvement. No blood, no gear, no trace of the mysterious hijacker. But for the FBI, there was no time for astonishment. The suspected jump zone was identified quickly. The search teams hit the ground fast. Inside the FBI's Seattle field office, agents worked around the clock. They examined the items Cooper had left behind. A black JCPenney clip-on tie, a mother-of-pearl tie clip, and 8 cigarette butts. Most FBI agents believed no one could have survived that jump. The terrain below was a mess of hills, rivers, and sharp tree lines. Cooper had no helmet, no visible lighting equipment, and was jumping with a bag full of cash, 21 pounds strapped to his waist or shoulders. If he'd landed in a tree or slammed into a rock face, he would have died instantly. These were bagged as evidence. The cigarette butts might have yielded DNA, had modern technology existed then. But in the 1970s, that was still decades away. The first theory to emerge was simple. Cooper was dead. But this theory came with a problem. If Cooper had died, where was the body? Where was the parachute? Where was the money? By early 1972, the FBI had compiled a list of over 800 potential suspects. One early suspect was Dwan Weber, a career criminal who had served time for bank robbery. Another was Richard Floyd McCoy, a Vietnam veteran and recreational skydiver. Then there was Kenneth Christensen, a former paratrooper, flight attendant for Northwest Orient, and ground crew member. Over the years, theories began to multiply. Some were credible, but one thing was certain. No one had ever found him. In 1978, a small clue reignited interest. A hunter in a rural area north of Reno near the suspected flight path discovered a placard in the woods. Then came the most startling discovery of all. In 1980, a boy named Brian Ingram was digging a fire pit on a sandy bank of the Columbia River near Vancouver. The FBI examined the serial numbers. They matched the ransom money given to Cooper. It was the first and only time any of the stolen cash had ever surfaced. Experts speculated. Some said the money had been buried intentionally. Was Cooper alive and trying to plant evidence? Was it a failed escape attempt, or had the money washed ashore after Cooper drowned? Once again, the evidence raised more questions than answers. By the 1990s, Norjak had become a cold case, but it still haunted agents who had spent years trying to crack it. And while many assumed Cooper was dead, others believed he had succeeded, escaped to a new life with a new identity. In the 2000s, technological advances gave new hope. In 2007, another parachute was found buried on private property in southwestern Washington. By 2011, on the 40th anniversary, The case drew global media attention again. One researcher, Tom Kay, led a citizen team known as the Cooper Research Team. It was the closest thing to a modern clue, a theory that Cooper wasn't just a thrill seeker, he was an insider. By the early 1980s, the D.B. Cooper investigation had moved from being just a manhunt to a national obsession. The FBI, while still combing through physical evidence, had shifted its focus towards suspects, real people who could fit the profile, who might have been the legendary D.B. Cooper. Over 1,000 individuals had been considered. Some were quickly ruled out. Others, more mysteriously, hung in the air like ghosts, matching the description, possessing relevant experience, and, in some cases, even offering chilling deathbed confessions. Like Cooper, he carried a fake hand grenade and a pistol. Somewhere over Utah, he parachuted out the rear of the aircraft. The FBI raided his house and found a jumpsuit, a duffel bag of cash, and a handwritten hijacking plan. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison. Like Cooper, he passed a note to a flight attendant, and just like Cooper, he demanded a ransom. This time $500,000 and 4 parachutes. He escaped from prison in 1974 by stealing a garbage truck and was killed in a shootout with FBI agents shortly afterward. Born in 1926, he was a quiet, private man who served in World War II, worked for the very airline Cooper hijacked, and lived a modest life in the Pacific Northwest. Once again, the passengers were unaware. A hijacking was in progress. After his death in 1994, Christensen's brother found a cache of strange items, large sums of money, a gold watch, and newspaper clippings about D.B. Cooper. He also had connections at Seattle. He'd also purchased a house in cash, odd for someone earning a modest wage. So let us take a deep dive into the prime suspects. The men. He even physically resembled the D.B. Cooper sketch. However, the FBI eventually ruled McCoy out, citing several differences in his MO's speech and age. And McCoy was in Las Vegas with his family during the Cooper hijacking, an alibi his wife confirmed. They noted he was shorter and didn't resemble the composite sketch closely enough. No physical evidence linked him to the hijacking. The name that repeatedly surfaced with the most credibility was Richard Floyd McCoy Jr., a Vietnam veteran, helicopter pilot, devout Mormon, and most importantly, a convicted airplane hijacker. On April 7, 1972, less than 5 months after Cooper's jump, McCoy boarded United Airlines Flight 855 from Denver to Los Angeles. After the plane landed and McCoy received the ransom, he ordered the crew to take off again and headed towards San Francisco. Sound familiar? McCoy was caught 2 days later after bragging to friends about the heist. However, McCoy refused to stay locked up. So why do some people think McCoy was Cooper? The similarities are striking. The calm demeanor, the military training, and the overall execution of the crime. Still, the mystery lingered. Was McCoy inspired by Cooper, or was he refining the same plan for a second payday? Next up, Kenneth Peter Christiansen, a former paratrooper, mechanic, and flight attendant for Northwest Orient Airlines. He matched Cooper's description: slim, in his mid-40s, with short dark hair and a calm demeanor. Could Christensen have pulled it off? His military background included parachuting experience. As a flight attendant and mechanic, he had intimate knowledge of Boeing 727s, including the rear air stair mechanism. Despite all this, the FBI said Christensen did not fit Cooper's profile, but many independent investigators remain convinced he's the best match. A quite disciplined man who had the skills, knowledge, and opportunity. In 2011, a woman named Marla Cooper came forward, claiming her uncle L.D. Cooper had confessed to being D.B. Cooper. She recalled a childhood Thanksgiving in 1971 where her uncle showed up bruised and claiming he'd been in a car accident. Later she overheard a conversation where he allegedly said, "We did it. Our money problems are over." No strong evidence ever linked him to the case, and some in the Cooper community saw Marla's story as a publicity stunt. LD was a war veteran with skydiving experience. He reportedly hated the government and was fascinated by aviation. Marla described him as secretive and intense. These comics were never released in English, but Smith, with European connections and a working-class background, may have encountered them abroad. This tip prompted renewed interest. The FBI even tested DNA on a guitar strap he had once owned, but the results were inconclusive. Smith was a rail worker from New Jersey with a military background and an uncanny resemblance to the Coopers, and he had financial motives. Friends recalled him expressing resentment toward corporate America after losing his pension. What made him especially interesting were his connections to several Cooper-related keywords, including Marxism and railroad. Still, L.D. Cooper remains one of the more colorful names on the list, if not the most convincing. These elements were used in aerospace and defense manufacturing in the late 1960s and early 1970s. In the 2000s, scientists conducted a forensic analysis of the tie, not for DNA, but for particles. He could have had access to aircraft information, understood engineering specs, and likely wore a tie to work every day, just like the one he left behind. Then there's William J. Smith, an obscure figure, until citizen sleuths uncovered his background. Why is that important? Remember, Don Cooper was the name of a Belgian comic book hero, a Canadian pilot who went on wild airborne adventures. Smith also worked in industries dealing with the same rare particles, titanium and cerium, that were found on Cooper's. She later retracted the claim, saying it was a joke. Barbara was a licensed pilot, had skydiving experience, and had reason to resent aviation authorities. Could the D.B. Cooper case have been a rare instance of a woman in disguise, executing one of the most audacious crimes in U.S. history? Before her transition, she had applied for a commercial pilot's license but was denied due to vision issues. She remained bitter about the rejection for years. He wasn't erratic. He wasn't nervous. He knew exactly what he wanted, but once again, no physical evidence tied him to the hijacking, and he passed away before any formal charges were filed. The DNA and the tie clue. One of the most tantalizing clues in the case is the black clip-on tie Cooper left behind on seat 180. The results were bizarre. Under powerful electron microscopes, researchers found particles of titanium, cerium, strontium, sulfide, and bismuth, extremely rare elements, especially in consumer environments. They called the investigation exhausted, noting that every lead had been followed. That narrowed things down. The Cooper research team, led by Tom Kent, concluded that the man behind the hijacking likely worked in a high-tech industrial environment, perhaps at Boeing or a subcontractor. The tie became a key forensic link to the idea that Cooper was not just a thrill-seeker or a desperate criminal, but an educated man with insider knowledge, a forgotten confession. Barbara Dayton. Among the more unusual suspects is Barbara Dayton, born Robert Dayton, a former Navy veteran and amateur pilot who underwent gender-affirming surgery in 1969. In the 1970s, Barbara allegedly told friends she had pulled off the Cooper hijacking, disguising herself as a man, jumping from the plane, and hiding out in the forest. Many brushed off the story, but some investigators took it seriously. No hard evidence ever emerged to support the claim, but it remains one of the most provocative theories. So who was it? With the case closed in 2016, the FBI stated publicly that none of the suspects, not Christensen, not McCoy, not L.D. Cooper, ever met the necessary threshold of evidence. But for amateur sleuths, authors, former agents, and curious minds around the world, that answer wasn't enough. They point to the flight crew's description: a calm, middle-aged man, soft-spoken, polite, and meticulously prepared. And how to get it? That level of control suggested military training, technical knowledge, and perhaps even inside help. Or maybe someone picked him up after landing. A small conspiracy, tightly held. Some theorists believe Cooper had assistants. Maybe someone at the airport helped prepare the parachutes. Others think Cooper died in the wilderness, his body simply never found in the vast, wet forests of Washington. After all, hundreds of square miles remain unexplored even today. The untouched ransom, and the confidence Cooper showed, as if he knew he would survive. Echoes of a voice in a rainstorm, shadows of a man in sunglasses with a bourbon in hand, waiting for the stairs to lower. But if that's true, how do you explain the missing money? We are left with only speculation and profiles. Pieces of men who might have been Cooper, but one thing is clear. D.B. Cooper wasn't just a criminal, he was a mystery wrapped in discipline. Dressed in a business suit, and carried out with surgical precision. It had grown into a myth, a story passed down, reimagined, and reframed countless times. He knew technical details about the Boeing 727 that few civilians would, like the fact that it could fly at a low speed and altitude with a rear stairway deployed. Search teams combed the suspected landing zone for weeks, then years, and eventually decades passed with no significant breakthrough. Supporters of this theory point to Cooper's calm demeanor during the hijacking. He appeared confident, methodical, and prepared, something only military personnel, engineers, or airline employees would typically know. A partial exception came in 1980, when a young boy named Brian Ingram found $5,800 buried in the sand along the Columbia River, money later confirmed to be part of Cooper's ransom. One theory suggests Cooper was an undercover government agent conducting a covert operation, and the hijacking was a cover. Another posits that Cooper didn't act alone, that he had inside help from airline employees, or even someone within the FBI. But the rest of the cache, and Cooper himself, remained missing. Some were Vietnam veterans with parachuting experience. Others were airline workers with grudges or mysterious disappearances, but none were ever conclusively linked to the crime. The FBI officially closed its investigation in 2016, stating that they had exhausted all credible leads. But for many, that only deepened the legend. Why close the case if there were still questions unanswered? Why was so little of the money found? Could Cooper have really gotten away clean in an age before digital tracking, cell phones, or facial recognition? According to the FBI and many skydiving experts, Cooper's chances of surviving were slim. Whether he perished in the forests of Washington or lived out his days quietly under a new identity, his legend lives on. Cooper didn't just hijack a plane, he hijacked history, and he's still flying through the collective imagination of a nation that loves an unsolved mystery. The night was stormy, visibility was almost zero, and he jumped into a freezing wilderness, likely somewhere near the dense forests of Washington. Some suggest he had an accomplice waiting on the ground with a vehicle or even a hidden camp. He told the flight crew his name was Don Cooper, but the media misreported it as D.B. Cooper, a name that stuck. In 2011, a team of amateur sleuths known as the Citizen Sleuths analyzed the tie under an electron microscope. They found rare particles titanium, strontium sulfide, suggesting Cooper may have worked in a specialized field like aerospace, chemicals, or advanced engineering. Boeing, based in Seattle, was one of the few companies where exposure to these elements was possible at the time. This reinforced the theory that Cooper may have been a Boeing employee or a contractor with insider knowledge of the aircraft. Don Cooper happens to be the name of a fictional Canadian comic book pilot popular in French-speaking parts of Europe and Canada, but virtually unknown in the US. The comic featured a character who often parachuted from planes and carried out daring missions. This has led many to speculate that the hijacker was either Canadian, French, or someone who had served overseas in Europe and encountered the comic. Others believe he buried the money, changed his identity, and disappeared into another state or another country. He had no helmet, no obvious survival gear, and was carrying a bag filled with 20 pounds of cash. He was also using a non-steerable parachute, one that would give him no control over where he landed. Even worse, one of the reserve chutes he took was actually a dummy, designed for classroom training and not functional. If he had intended to use it, he might not have known it wouldn't open. With no body, no definitive suspect, and almost no trace of the money, Cooper's escape became not just a puzzle, but a canvas for speculation. The truth remains elusive. By the late 1990s, the D.B. Cooper hijacking had long since moved beyond a mere criminal investigation. One of the most persistent and widely accepted theories is that Cooper never survived the jump. Still, despite the logic of that theory, no body was ever recovered. That 1980 discovery fueled the second most dominant theory: that Cooper survived. If Cooper had a military background, especially with parachuting or survival training, he might have jumped into the dark, rainy wilderness with a pre-planned escape route. Adding intrigue to this theory is Cooper's choice of alias. Another clue lay in the clip-on tie Cooper left on the plane. Of course, no theory is complete without wilder versions. Over the years, many individuals have been put forward as possible suspects. The mystery remains intact for one simple reason: Cooper was never found, dead or alive. These questions are what fuel the enduring fascination. D.B. Cooper has become more than a criminal. He's a symbol of rebellion, ingenuity, and mystery. By the late 1990s, the D.B. Cooper hijacking had long since moved beyond a mere criminal investigation. It had grown into a myth, a story passed down, reimagined, and reframed countless times. With no body, no definitive suspect, and almost no trace of the money, Cooper's escape became not just a puzzle, but a canvas for speculation. One of the most persistent and widely accepted theories is that Cooper never survived the jump. According to the FBI and many skydiving experts, Cooper's chances of surviving were slim. The night was stormy, visibility was almost zero, and he jumped into a freezing wilderness, likely somewhere near the dense forests of Washington. He had no helmet, no obvious survival gear, and was carrying a bag filled with 20 pounds of cash. He was also using a non-steerable parachute, one that would give him no control over where he landed. Even worse, one of the reserve chutes he took was actually a dummy, designed for classroom training and not functional. If he had intended to use it, he might not have known it wouldn't open. Still, despite the logic of that theory, no body was ever recovered. Search teams combed the suspected landing zone for weeks, then years, and eventually decades passed with no significant breakthrough. A partial exception came in 19 when a young boy named Brian Ingram found $5,800 buried in the sand along the Columbia River, money later confirmed to be part of Cooper's ransom. But the rest of the cash, and Cooper himself, remained missing. That 1980 discovery fueled the second most dominant theory: that Cooper survived. Supporters of this theory point to Cooper's calm demeanor during the hijacking. He appeared confident, methodical, and prepared. He knew technical details about the Boeing 727 that few civilians would, like the fact that it could fly at a low speed and altitude with the rear stairway deployed, something only military personnel, engineers, or airline employees would typically know. If Cooper had a military background, especially with parachuting or survival training, he might have jumped into the dark, rainy wilderness with a pre-planned escape route. Some suggest he had an accomplice waiting on the ground with a vehicle or even a hidden camp. Others believe he buried the money, changed his identity, and disappeared into another state or another country. Adding intrigue to this theory is Cooper's choice of alias. He told the flight crew his name was Dan Cooper, but the media misreported it as D.B. Cooper, a name that stuck. Don Cooper happens to be the name of a fictional Canadian comic book pilot popular in French-speaking parts of Europe and Canada, but virtually unknown in the US. The comic featured a character who often parachuted from planes and carried out daring missions. This has led many to speculate that the hijacker was either Canadian, French, or someone who had served overseas in Europe and encountered the comic. Another clue lay in the clip-on tie Cooper left on a plane. In 2011, a team of amateur sleuths known as the Citizen Sleuths analyzed the tie under an electron microscope. They found rare particles titanium, strontium sulfide, suggesting Cooper may have worked in a specialized field like aerospace, chemicals, or advanced engineering. Boeing, based in Seattle, was one of the few companies where exposure to these elements was possible at the time. This reinforced the theory that Cooper may have been a Boeing employee or a contractor with insider knowledge of the aircraft. Of course, no theory is complete without wilder versions. One theory suggests Cooper was an undercover government agent conducting a covert operation, and the hijacking was a cover. Another posits that Cooper didn't act alone, that he had inside help from airline employees or even someone within the FBI. Over the years, many individuals have been put forward as possible suspects. Some were Vietnam veterans with parachuting experience. Others were airline workers with grudges or mysterious disappearances, but none were ever conclusively linked to the crime. The mystery remains intact for one simple reason: Cooper was never found, dead or alive. The FBI officially closed its investigation in 2016, stating that they had exhausted all credible leads. But for many, that only deepened the legend. Why close the case if there were still questions unanswered? Why was so little of the money found? Could Cooper have really gotten away clean in an age before digital tracking, cell phones, or facial recognition? Cooper knew the Boeing 727-100 could deploy its air stairs in midair, a fact not widely known outside of aviation circles. He also knew the altitude limitations, understood how to keep the plane slow enough for a jump, and didn't panic when fuel delays forced him to adjust the plan. That knowledge suggests Cooper may have been a former pilot, flight engineer, or Boeing employee. Boeing, headquartered in Seattle, was surrounded by subcontractors in the 1970s, many of whom used the rare industrial chemicals later found on Cooper's team. This has led many sleuths to narrow the suspect pool to technicians, engineers, or contractors who worked in aviation during the late 1960s. The working theory: Cooper was laid off or forced out of the industry during the airline recession of the early 70s. Bitter, knowledgeable, and skilled, he hatched the hijacking as a form of revenge and financial retribution. Some investigators believe Cooper's calmness came from familiarity. He knew the 707 inside and out, because he had worked on them for years. Could this theory explain why he was never caught? If he worked in the industry, he would know how to disappear, which documents not to leave behind, and how to cover his tracks. And if he'd changed his name or died shortly after the heist, he may have left no paper trail at all. This theory focuses on the alias Cooper chose, Don Cooper. In 1971, the Don Cooper comic series was popular in French-speaking Europe and Canada but was never officially published in English. The character, a Royal Canadian Air Force test pilot, regularly parachuted from aircraft, flew secret missions, and outwitted enemies in high-stakes adventures. Cooper choosing the name Don Cooper is suspicious. It wasn't a common American name at the time, so how would he know about the comic? Theory says Cooper may have served in the military and been stationed in Europe where he encountered the comic. Perhaps the name meant something to him, a symbol of his own identity as a flyer or a way to hint at his background. The comic also contains several eerily similar plot lines: parachuting from planes, secret missions involving ransom, escaping into the woods, faking identities to believers. This connection wasn't coincidence. It was Cooper's wink to the world, a subtle signature left behind. Now we enter the conspiracy zone. Some believe Cooper was not a criminal at all, but an agent of the US government performing a black ops mission. What kind of mission? That depends on who you ask. In one version, Cooper was testing aircraft vulnerability in skydiving logistics under stress. The hijacking was staged, the money faker returned, and Cooper returned to government protection. In another, he was part of a covert operation to move money or information, and the hijacking was a... There's even a more dramatic version. Cooper had discovered something damning about the military, about Vietnam, or about government corruption, and was using the hijacking as leverage. He vanished, not because he escaped, but because the government made him disappear. There is, of course, zero hard evidence for this theory, but like all good conspiracies, it thrives on the lack of resolution and the mystery surrounding the case. Why was the investigation closed in 2016 without a final answer? Why were some case files sealed or redacted? And why, in 50 years, has the FBI never definitively named a suspect? These are the questions that keep conspiracy alive. A less discussed but compelling theory is that Cooper had an accomplice or several. The plan was too precise. Some argue he had to have someone waiting on the ground, maybe with a truck, a radio, or supplies. Someone who helped choose the flight path, the jump location, and the weather conditions. Cooper may have been the face, but not the mastermind. This could explain the near-total disappearance of physical evidence. If he was picked up minutes after landing, the parachute could have been recovered, the money hidden, and Cooper himself whisked to safety. This also raises a question: was someone at the airline or airport involved? Although there's no proof of inside help, some believe a low-level employee could have provided flight info, parachute access, or plane diagrams, all useful to someone plotting a mid-air escape. Myth versus reality. In the years following the hijacking, D.B. Cooper became a folk hero. Songs were written about him. Bars named cocktails after him. He was the subject of books, documentaries, and movies. A D.B. Cooper festival is even held annually in Ariel, Washington. Why the fascination? Part of it is the mystery. Unsolved crimes always attract attention, but Cooper also embodied a particular anti-hero archetype. Intelligent and polite, non-violent, targeted a corporation, not civilians. Vanish without harming anyone. In an era of political unrest, Vietnam, Watergate, and rising mistrust in institutions, Cooper represented rebellion without cruelty, a man who broke the rules with style and vanished into legend. Whether he was a criminal, a genius, or just lucky, he did something no one else had, and got away with it. Conclusion. The legacy of the jump. 50 years later, we're left with more questions than answers. If Cooper survived, why never spend the money? If he died, where's the body? If he was caught, why no confession? And why in all this time has no one been definitively linked to the crime? Maybe that's the true brilliance of D.B. Cooper, not just the crime itself, but the way it's remained unsolvable, untouched by time. Cooper didn't just vanish into the sky, he vanished into American myth, and perhaps that's where he wanted to live all along.